Hey, welcome to another live episode of geekoutdoors.com. Now, a lot of us who use Linux, all of us started as noobs or newbies. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today because I think that whenever we use Linux, people who use it on a regular basis, a lot of times, we don't really think, I would say, or really remember when we ourselves were newbies. Now, in the Linux world, we have all types of users. We have people like myself who is a general Linux user. And then we also have people who can actually work on the Linux kernel and actually write assembly code. So there's many different levels. And so I'm going to go over some of my experiences and from what I can remember, because I've been using Linux for quite a while. And so let's go ahead and talk about my journey. And I'm going to start with Red Hat Linux because that was my first exposure to Linux. And I think for a lot of people, maybe that was their first exposure too, if they were old enough to remember Red Hat Linux. And so if you remember, Linux was introduced, if I remember correctly, like 1991. And then Red Hat Linux, actually, their first version was actually released in 1995. Now, I can't remember if it was in the late 90s or early 2000. It was in that time frame that I actually got a hold of Red Hat Linux. And at the time, the Linux was really still a very super niche thing. And a lot of people who used Linux were not general consumers at all. They were really tech people. You had to be a super nerd to actually be able to use Linux. And also at the time, the whole internet, or as it was known back at that time, the internet super highway was actually something new, or actually it's called the information superhighway, and it was something really new. So you just couldn't go on the internet and just go download or learn whatever you want or watch a whole bunch of YouTube videos. At that time, message boards were still really popular. A lot of people were still using things like AOL chat. And, so the internet was also still in its infancy. So we were still reading something called magazines. Magazines are still around, but magazines were a key source of information for a lot of geeks and nerds out there. And so I did have a computer magazine, and this is where I don't really remember. I'm pretty sure it was a Red Hat Linux CD-ROM at the back of the magazine, or it might have come in multiple diskettes, but I'm pretty sure it was a CD-ROM. And so at that time, Windows 95 was still popular. And this brand new version of Windows is actually Windows XP at the time. That was out. And, people were still using MS-DOS. Okay, I used MS-DOS for a long time. And so I was fairly confident for the most part that I could actually install Linux, because back then when you were installing Windows, especially if it's like Windows 3.0 up to Windows 95, there was still a lot of command line driven areas as well. And so I felt confident, yeah, I could do it. And so Red Hat Linux at the time, like I said, it was pretty much, I think it was the first one, the first definitely popular one, I would say. And as you can see right here, Red Hat Linux has changed, not too dramatically, but also it has changed dramatically because it is probably the most popular commercial version. They're not, when I think about Red Hat, I don't think about a distro that you would just go and download, because that's really not how it works anymore. Red Hat is really a company that's focused on the commercial aspect of it. And so if you're going to be getting into Red Hat Linux, you're going to be spending money, okay? And if you can look here at their history, this is since 1993, and I think that's when the company was founded, but the first release was actually in 1995. And as you can see here, they've made a lot of strides in the whole Linux world. And like I said, Red Hat does definitely, they are a commercial company. I think they were the first Linux company to hit revenues of $1 billion. And so, so back then, Red Hat Linux, that was the version. And that image reminds me a lot of Carmen Sandiego. Okay, so getting back to the point, when I got the CD and I was trying to install it, it was really difficult. Okay, I mean, at that time, I thought, okay, I could do this from the command line. I could even do things like partitioning, okay? But the partitioning, when I got to that part, it was already difficult because Linux uses a different file system than Windows, okay? So that was hard, if I remember correctly. And that took me a few hours to actually figure out, And you got to remember, once again, we did not have the internet back then like we did today. So if you didn't know how to do something, if you couldn't find out message boards or some of the few internet sites, and there really wasn't many at that time because the internet was still about Yahoo and stuff like that. Okay, so you just really couldn't go and find that information. And so a lot of times these computer magazines actually had instructions, really basic instructions on, hey, we included this CD-ROM with it, and sometimes it'd be a game or something like that, but they would give you like some instructions to go for it. And that's what I used, but it wasn't enough. Okay, so once I figured out how to get the partitions done and I actually got it quote unquote installed, I ran into huge problems with getting the video drivers, graphics drivers to work. So the resolution wasn't correct. And you got to remember at the time, we were using these big old CRT computer monitors, and I just couldn't get it to work correctly. And then also the biggest thing was, even if I did get the actual graphics to work, okay, the video drivers, I still had a problem with the actual dial-up modem, the internet part. Yeah, there was dial-up modems back then, and so that made it pretty much, I would say almost, I wouldn't say useless, but whenever you have your computer, you wanted internet access and everything else, okay. So the graphics problems was definitely a hurdle, but combine that with the problems I have with the dial-up, I just stopped after that. I was just like, this is a nightmare. Linux is not for me. This Red Hat thing, and at the time, you got to remember, Linux was such a niche within a niche that you're gonna go back to Windows, and Apple Mac, they really didn't come back up yet. They really are not where they are today. So the majority of people were still 99% Windows if you were a desktop user. And so I gave that up. So I went back to my friendly Windows 95, and I think I had the brand new Windows XP as well at the time. And I didn't really do anything with Linux after that. I was just like, man, this is just way too hard. And as a matter of fact, it kind of hurt my my geek pride, because at that time I think I had already finished college, if I remember correctly, or maybe I was still in college. I can't really remember, but I had worked in computer labs and stuff, so I felt a lot of confidence. I even worked on Mac machines too, so I thought, yeah, I know my stuff. But after that experience, I didn't. Okay, so fast forward, I think around maybe 2005. Okay, and by this time I was already working in corporate. Okay, so I already had experience working in a Unix environment. Okay, so and I was more used to the command lines by that point. Okay, so it was a little bit different at that point. So this new thing for me came out. It was called Ubuntu Linux, and this looked really different. Okay, this wasn't what I remembered when I had tried Red Hat Linux. It was actually very let me see if I could get a picture, very Windows-like. Okay, so that's the first thing that I thought when I saw Ubuntu Linux. And obviously Ubuntu Linux didn't look like it does now, with the whole Unity engine. Back then, it looked a lot like Windows in terms of, you have your menus at the bottom, and you could put apps on there in the front. And you got to remember, around 2005, the GNOME desktop environment, that was still new. And if I remember correctly, the GNOME desktop environment was like in 98, I think, 98 or 99. And so it still was new, but at the same time, by 2005, when I actually first saw Ubuntu Linux, Linux had matured to the point where a graphical user interface was actually usable for average people. Okay, and before, as I mentioned earlier, before, Linux was just really for the hardcore, and it was all command line. Okay, but now I thought, wow, this looks different, and it was from this company, this little company by Mark Shuttleworth out in South Africa. So it was really, really different. And so this time, I'm pretty sure it was a CD-ROM as well. So the internet obviously was there, but it still wasn't, I don't think it was still what it is today, meaning you could just go download a whole distro. And even if you did, it would take a while to download, okay? And so I think I also got this from a magazine on a CD-ROM. And when I first booted it up and started installing it, I was actually blown away, because even though the installation for Linux is nowhere easy as it is now. Today, it is absolutely a piece of cake for the most part to install Linux, especially if you compare it to how it used to be. And so with the Ubuntu Linux install, it was so easy. Instead of taking hours and hours and hours, it probably took me about 2 hours to figure out, and everything was through the GUI, so that made it a lot easier. I still ran into some issues with partitioning, and then not as bad as it used to be. And then when I finally got installed, it took me quite a while to get everything working in terms of the graphics drivers and most importantly the internet along with it. But I got it to work. And everything was functional. That was the crazy thing. That's what was different with Ubuntu. The installation was way easier. I mean, still not extremely mass user friendly, but still a lot easier than anything I've ever tried. Well, anything I've ever tried was Red Hat. And then when you actually got stuff working, it worked. And I was like, okay, let me go ahead and give this a try. And obviously I still have my Windows machines. I am definitely not giving those up, with this new operating system. And so I still have my Windows XP machines. And I still had an older one with Windows 95. And so I always have my Windows machines. But as the weeks went on in using Ubuntu, day after day, and at that time, I had Open Office, as the Office suite. Okay, so I could do a lot of the same things that I did on Windows. And for the most part, I could do a lot of the same things that I did on my Windows machine. About the only thing I couldn't do, and it's kind of sad that it's still kind of this way, I couldn't play my video games. That was the bad thing. All the games were on Windows, and it's still the same today, but it has gotten a lot better for the Linux community. But everything else I could do, and I was getting more and more comfortable with using Linux. I was learning a lot about it. I was learning a lot about customization. I was learning a lot about what happens underneath. And like I said, I'm not like an expert on it. I was more of a general user. But because Linux, how it was different, how it was so much freedom, it was free. I still couldn't believe that. I didn't understand the whole concept of an open source community. And like I've mentioned in other videos, open source doesn't mean that it's free. Okay, as obviously I just noted with Red Hat. But a lot of open source projects, the code is freely available, and so they could make software that is free. And I was still absolutely blown away that this company Ubuntu provided something that could actually replace my Windows computer, and it was free. I couldn't believe that. And so I spent a lot of time just playing with it. I even spent a lot of times just with most new Linux users playing with Compiz, and trying out all these different special effects, and that was cool. I couldn't do that in my Windows machines. Working with different workspaces, that was something that I was used to when I was at work, where on my Unix machines we would have multiple different workspaces, and the environment was X Windows, and it was really cool, and the command line stuff, it was based upon Unix, very Unix like. And so so whatever I would do at work on the Unix machines, I could go home and like test them out on the Linux machines, which is really cool. A lot of the same commands, it was the same commands, and the shell was the same, and it was really, really cool. And so as I started using Ubuntu more and more over the weeks, over the months, I was just like, wow, maybe this is something I could use permanently, okay, instead of just using Windows, okay. And so slowly but surely, I would say like maybe a year, almost 2 years later, I really stopped using Windows, okay, as my main computer, okay. Now, obviously, I still use Windows every now and then today, but that's not what I have. Now, that is not my main computer, okay. So I could still use Windows, and I have no problems with using Windows, okay. However, since that time, after using Ubuntu for a few years, I was confident at that time, when using it so long, that I really could do without Windows. So that's what happened. And so something funny happened in between that time. I was doing this whole thing called distro hopping, and for people in the Linux community, they know what that means. And what that means is you could try out different versions, different flavors of Linux, which is something definitely foreign to people who are on Microsoft Windows and for people who are on Apple Mac. That's just really not available. And so at that time, I was trying out a lot of different distros, at least the ones that were available. One of the ones that I remember using was Kubuntu, and even though a lot of these distros are derived off of Ubuntu, and Ubuntu is based upon Debian, okay. And so I even tried the original Debian, and Kubuntu, I used that for a while as my main driver as well, like for I think almost a year, and I love the way it looked. And I even tried Arch when that became available, but that was much later. And I tried OpenSUSE, or it was SUSE Linux, and I think I also tried the one by Novell. I can't even remember the name now, but there was another popular flavor of Linux as well. And so I've tried many different ones, but it wasn't until Linux Mint, I think around 2008 or 2007 or 2008, when I tried and saw Linux Mint, and wow, I was just like, this is pretty awesome, okay? And by this point, Linux was definitely usable. You still had bugs, but it worked. Like I mean, I just couldn't believe it, And when I saw Linux Mint, what was different about Linux Mint wasn't really the way that it looked, because a lot of Linux distros by that time, GNOME, desktop environments, KDE, XFCE, and there were many other environments, okay, and some of them were just barely starting. But by that point, having a graphical user interface on Linux was nothing new, and a lot of them looked similar in terms of functionality. So Linux Mint, the way it looked, did not catch my attention like Ubuntu did when I first saw it. What did catch my attention was the stability of this. Linux Mint was rock solid, okay? And not to say that Ubuntu wasn't, but what I mean by that is, once you install Linux Mint, which was really easy, once you install Linux Mint, things just worked. I didn't have to spend a lot of time looking for drivers or running into weird issues or a lot of bugs, I mean, obviously, whenever you do install your system, you're still going to have to get drivers. But for Linux Mint, there wasn't really many things that I had to do, which just blew my mind. And it was like an extremely stable operating system. I mean, whenever I used Linux Mint, I could remember, like, coming from the Windows to Linux world, it's a huge transition, okay? And one of the things that, as newbies, that you'll notice is that there's certain things that you experience in Windows that you just don't experience much or at all in Linux. And one of the big things I had a problem with at that time when I had Windows was the fact that I would have a lot of lockups, or programs would freeze, or the blue screen to death, okay? And so anybody who's ever used Windows for a long time, they would understand. And it's a lot better now, but still, people would understand. And so it wouldn't be uncommon for you to reboot your computer a lot because of the fact that you would have a program crash or it would freeze or something like that. And so when I transitioned over to Ubuntu Linux, that happened less and less. And then when I transitioned over to Linux Mint, I think maybe in a whole year, I only had it like freeze or crash maybe 5 or 6 times. It at the most, if I can recall. And even today, it's not very common for me to have problems like it locking up unless there was some weird issue with the program, okay? And so that was what I loved about Linux Mint. It was extremely stable. Everything pretty much worked out of the box. And at the same time, the user interface, although it's not a really pretty looking user interface like you would get out of Plasma, for KDE, but it was functional. And it was familiar. That's one of the things that I liked about Ubuntu Linux at the time, because if you were a Windows user or even a Mac user, when you transition over, the transitions isn't as bad, okay? It's more familiar, and especially with Linux Mint, it's very, very Windows-like in terms of the way it functions, okay? So it's not as hard, okay? The learning curve is not as high. Okay, and so that was one of the big things as a Linux noob, that the learning curve is pretty high, but nowadays it's a lot easier. And so once I got into Linux Mint, I kind of like really stepped away from doing the whole distro hopping thing, and I stopped using Ubuntu Linux as my main version of Linux, mainly because Linux Mint was just so much better in my opinion, especially for somebody who is a general user. And with that, I've really never looked back on any other Linux distros that I use. I would try other Linux distros every now and then, but I always found myself going back to Linux Mint. And that's the reason why on a lot of my videos, pretty much all of them, they're primarily catered and targeted towards the Linux newbie, okay, or the Linux general user. And so, for the videos that I produce, and I'll continue to produce, I really want it to be something that I wish I had as a Linux noob. I wish I had more of a general user, as much as possible, step by step, because, I've said this so many times in my videos, I really love Linux, and I really feel like it is an amazing option for people, to use, okay? And the fact that it's free, it's even more incredible, okay, that you would get this type of user experience. And then you have more options. You know, I just want to get to the point where you have options, you have the freedom to choose, you know. And so out of all the distros, Linux Mint is still my favorite. It's still the most noob friendly out of all of them. And every iteration of Linux Mint, they just keep improving on the areas where they really do perform the best. Okay, their ease of use, their stability, and I would also say if I had to think about branding, okay, because even though we don't think of Linux as something that has a commercial aspect, you know, maybe except for Red Hat Linux, all of these are companies, you know. I mean, all of these have people, all of these have a brand attached to it. Okay, so when I think about Linux Mint, I think about the brand for newbies. You know, this is the Linux brand for newbies, you know. And so yeah, so that was my story, you know, of a Linux noob. You know, I really consider myself as always a Linux noob because of the simple fact that, you know, with Linux, there's always something new to learn. You know, and the whole community, there's so many different aspects of it that you'll never be able to master it. And that's wonderful, you know, because that means that you're always able to learn and you're always able to grow. And, you know, as more and more distros come out, as Linux becomes more ingrained into so many parts of our lives, it's going to be even more exciting to see what happens in the whole newbie community in the future, because I'm positive there's going to be more and more people coming into Linux, and I'll be there to produce all those newbie friendly Linux videos. So that is it for this live episode. I did actually do a blog on this. Okay, if you wanted to see my blog, you wanted to read it, I'll leave that in the link below. So, and as always, you know, if there's any comments you had, any ideas, or if you wanted to share your own Linux noob story, be sure to leave that in the comments area as well. So if you did get a lot of value out of these videos, leave a like and subscribe. And as always, if you did also want to support my channel, you could also do that at patreon.com/geekoutdoors. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in another episode.